The heavy oak lid groaned, protesting years of undisturbed slumber, as Alistair, the formidable Duke of Blackwood, heaved it open. Dust motes danced in the sliver of sunlight, illuminating forgotten memories. Beneath layers of yellowed lace, his fingers brushed against a thick, leather-bound journal. Its pages held a meticulously penned last will and testament dated decades prior. His grandfather's hand declared a shocking decree. The Blackwood estate, its vast lands and formidable fortune, would pass not to his direct heir, but to a distant cousin, unless Alistair, the current duke, fulfilled a singular, astonishing condition. His gaze fell upon the final, elegant script, his breath catching as he read, "And upon his 25th year, Alistair shall take as his wife Miss Eleanor Vance, the Governess." The words hung in the stale air, binding his future to a woman he barely acknowledged, a woman whose humble station was undeniable. The Duke, master of all he surveyed, found himself ensnared by a promise made long before his birth, a promise that threatened to unravel his carefully constructed world and elevate a mere governess to the Duchess of Blackwood. If you are listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you are listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. Miss Eleanor Vance traced the intricate pattern of the damask curtains in the nursery, her fingers lingering on the faded gold threads. Outside, the sprawling gardens of Blackwood Manor stretched endlessly, a vibrant tapestry of manicured lawns and ancient oaks. Yet to Eleanor, they felt as distant and unattainable as the stars. Her world was confined to these four walls, to the incessant chatter of Lady Beatrice and Master Thomas, the Duke's young wards, and the endless cycle of lessons, mending, and quiet observation. She was a governess, a position that placed her above the servants, yet firmly beneath the family, a perpetual outsider in the grand gilded cage that was Blackwood. Her beauty, a delicate bloom of auburn hair and eyes the colour of a summer sky, was a cruel irony, for it only served to highlight her precarious station, a constant reminder of what she could never be. The very air she breathed in this opulent house was heavy with the unspoken rules of class and decorum, a suffocating weight that pressed down on her spirit, even as she strove to maintain an outward composure. Each morning, as the first rays of dawn pierced the heavy clouds over the estate, Eleanor would rise, her dreams of a life beyond these walls fading with the night. She would dress in her simple, practical gowns, her reflection in the polished silver of her small hand mirror revealing a face that, despite its youth and natural grace, bore the subtle marks of quiet resignation. The air in the nursery was always thick with the scent of lavender and old books, a comforting aroma that did little to soothe the gnawing ache of loneliness in her heart. Eleanor had arrived at Blackwood 2 years prior, a young woman of 20, orphaned and with little to her name save a sharp mind and an unyielding spirit. Her parents, a scholar and a gentlewoman of modest means, had instilled in her a love for learning and a quiet dignity that set her apart from many in her position. But dignity, she had quickly learned, did not pay the bills or secure one's future in Regency society. It merely allowed one to endure the slights with a straight back and a composed expression, a shield against the casual cruelty of a world that valued birthright above all else. She often wondered what her future held, a bleak landscape of continued servitude, perhaps a position in a less grand but equally confining household, until old age rendered her useless. The thought was a cold comfort, a constant reminder of her limited options, a future stretching before her like a long grey road with no discernible turning. She would often steal moments by the window, watching the carriages come and go, carrying guests to and from the Duke's lavish entertainments, knowing she was merely a shadow in the background, an unseen presence whose sole purpose was to ensure the children were well behaved and educated. The Duke of Blackwood, Alistair, was a man of imposing presence and even more imposing arrogance. He moved through his ancestral home like a dark storm cloud, his tall, lean frame exuding an aura of power and disdain. His dark hair perpetually falling across a brow that seemed permanently furrowed in thought or irritation, and his piercing grey eyes held a cold, calculating glint that rarely softened. To Eleanor, he was a distant, formidable figure, a man who saw her as little more than a necessary fixture in his household, a cog in the well-oiled machine of his aristocratic life. Their interactions were brief, formal, and always punctuated by his barely concealed impatience. He was the epitome of the titled gentleman, outwardly distinguished, impeccably dressed, and possessed of a sharp wit that he often wielded like a weapon, cutting down those he deemed beneath him with a casual flick of his tongue. Yet, beneath the polished veneer, Eleanor sensed a deep-seated dissatisfaction, a restless energy that even his vast wealth and ancient lineage could not quell. He was a man accustomed to having his every whim catered to, his every command obeyed, and his world revolved around the rigid expectations of his class, a world he seemed to resent even as he upheld its every stricture. He was a paradox, a man of immense privilege who carried the weight of his position like a heavy cloak, never truly comfortable, always striving for something just beyond his reach, a phantom desire that haunted his every step. His presence alone was enough to make the air crackle with an almost oppressive authority, a constant reminder of the chasm that separated their two worlds. One blustery afternoon, as Eleanor attempted to coax Lady Beatrice through her French verbs, the Duke's booming voice echoed from the hall below, a sound that always sent a shiver down her spine. "Miss Vance, a word, if you please." His tone brooked no argument, no delay. With a quick instruction to the children, Eleanor smoothed her simple muslin gown, a garment chosen for its practicality rather than its fashion, and descended the grand staircase, her heart thrumming a nervous rhythm against her ribs. The polished banister felt cold beneath her fingertips, a stark contrast to the warmth of her apprehension. Each step she took down the sweeping, carpeted stairs felt like a descent into an arena where she was always at a disadvantage. She found him in the vast library, a room filled with the scent of aged leather and beeswax, standing before the towering fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows across his stern features, making him appear even more formidable, a dark silhouette against the roaring fire. The air crackled with an unspoken tension, a prelude to what she instinctively knew would be an unpleasant encounter. The heavy velvet drapes were drawn against the encroaching gloom of the afternoon, lending the room an air of solemnity, almost as if it were a courtroom. "You wished to see me, Your Grace?" she inquired, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, a testament to her years of practice in maintaining composure under duress, a skill honed through countless difficult conversations. He turned, his grey eyes sweeping over her with an almost clinical detachment, as if assessing a piece of furniture rather than a human being, his gaze lingering for a fraction too long on her face before moving on. "Indeed, Miss Vance, I have received a communication regarding the children's education. It seems their progress in Latin is lacking." His words were clipped, precise, each one a subtle accusation, delivered with the casual cruelty of a man who rarely considered the impact of his pronouncements on those beneath him. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, threatening to crush her carefully constructed composure. Eleanor felt a flush creep up her neck, a hot wave of indignation warring with the ingrained habit of deference. "Your Grace, Master Thomas is still quite young, and Lady Beatrice has shown a remarkable aptitude for languages, though Latin is proving a challenge. I assure you, I am employing every method at my disposal, including the use of visual aids and conversational practice, which I believe are more effective for young minds than rote memorization. Perhaps a different approach, one that fosters a love for the subject rather than merely enforcing its rules, might yield better results." She dared to meet his gaze, a flicker of defiance in her own eyes, a silent challenge to his dismissive attitude. Alistair merely raised a dark eyebrow, a gesture that spoke volumes of his skepticism, dismissing her efforts with a silent, arrogant judgment. "Methods, Miss Vance, are only as effective as the results they produce. My grandfather, the late Duke, was a formidable scholar. He would not have tolerated such deficiencies." He paused, his gaze fixed on her, and for a fleeting moment, Eleanor thought she detected a flicker of something akin to curiosity in his eyes, quickly masked by his usual hauteur. It was a fleeting glimpse into a deeper complexity she rarely saw, a momentary crack in his impenetrable facade. "There are certain expectations, Miss Vance, that come with the Blackwood name. Expectations that extend to every member of this household, however minor their role. The reputation of this family, and by extension my own, depends on the impeccable upbringing of these children. Their intellectual development is paramount, and I expect nothing less than excellence. I trust you comprehend the gravity of this responsibility and the potential consequences should these standards not be met." His voice, though low, carried an unmistakable undertone of warning. The implication was clear. She was failing, and her position, already tenuous, was now under scrutiny, hanging by a thread. Eleanor bowed her head slightly, a silent acknowledgement of her place, the weight of his words pressing down on her, threatening to suffocate her. "I understand, Your Grace. I shall redouble my efforts and perhaps introduce a more structured approach to their classical studies, incorporating additional exercises and perhaps even a weekly recitation to solidify their understanding." She felt a familiar knot of despair tighten in her stomach. "See that you do," he replied, dismissing her with a curt nod, his attention already drifting back to the towering bookshelves, as if the conversation had been a mere interruption to his more important pursuits. As she turned to leave, he added, almost as an afterthought, his voice a low rumble, "And ensure the children are presentable for the Duchess of Rutland's ball next week. It is a significant event, and their appearance reflects upon the family. I expect them to be paragons of youthful decorum, a credit to Blackwood in every respect." The casualness of his tone belied the underlying command, a reminder of her duties, both explicit and implicit. Eleanor curtsied, her mind already racing with the preparations required. The Duchess of Rutland's ball. It was the social event of the season, a glittering spectacle of wealth and power that she, as a governess, would only ever glimpse from the periphery, if at all. The thought of the dazzling gowns, the sparkling jewels, the whispered intrigues, filled her with a strange mix of longing and resignation. She imagined the ball, a whirlwind of colour and music, a world utterly alien to her own, yet one she was tasked with preparing the children for. Yet his mention of it, coupled with his earlier reference to his grandfather, stirred a faint, unsettling ripple in her thoughts. There was a peculiar intensity in his tone when he spoke of the late Duke, a sense of obligation that seemed to weigh heavily upon him, a burden he carried with a grim determination, almost as if he were bound by an unseen chain. She had heard whispers among the servants, fragmented tales of an eccentric old duke, of a will that was never quite settled, of a family secret that lay buried deep within the manor's ancient walls, a secret that had been the subject of hushed conversations for years. But such gossip was not for her ears, and she quickly dismissed it, focusing instead on the immediate task of improving Master Thomas's Latin declensions, and ensuring Lady Beatrice's curtsies were perfectly executed, her mind a flurry of educational strategies and sartorial considerations. As the days passed, a subtle shift seemed to occur in the Duke's demeanour, a barely perceptible tension that tightened his jaw and deepened the lines around his eyes. He was often closeted in the library for hours, poring over old documents, his usually impeccable attire slightly dishevelled, a rare sign of his preoccupation, his cravat loosened, his hair more unruly than usual. Eleanor, catching glimpses of him in the corridors, noticed his preoccupied air, his distant gaze, as if his mind were miles away, wrestling with some profound internal struggle, a battle fought in the silent confines of his own thoughts. He seemed to be searching for something, or perhaps grappling with a profound revelation that had shaken the very foundations of his world, disturbing the carefully ordered universe of the Duke of Blackwood. The children, too, sensed the change, becoming unusually subdued, their boisterous games replaced by quiet whispers and anxious glances towards the library door, as if fearing to disturb the brooding silence emanating from within. Even the usually unflappable housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, seemed to walk with a more hushed tread, her eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, exchanging knowing glances with the other servants. The entire household seemed to hold its breath, anticipating an unknown event. One evening, as Eleanor sat by the nursery window, mending a tear in Lady Beatrice's favourite doll, a sudden, violent gust of wind rattled the panes. The sky outside was a bruised purple, threatening a storm, the ancient trees swaying wildly as if in protest against an unseen force, their branches clawing at the darkening sky. A sense of foreboding settled over her, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather, but rather with the palpable shift in the atmosphere of Blackwood. She thought of the Duke, locked away in his library, and the strange, unsettling feeling that had begun to cling to Blackwood Manor like a shroud, a palpable presence that permeated every stone and timber, whispering of secrets and impending change. There was a secret here, she was certain, a secret that was about to be unearthed, a truth that would shatter the carefully constructed facade of their lives, exposing the raw, uncomfortable reality beneath. And she, a humble governess, felt an inexplicable pull towards its impending revelation, a sense of being inextricably linked to the unfolding drama, a pawn in a game she barely understood. The golden cage, she realized with a jolt, was about to be shaken, and she, for all her insignificance, was somehow caught within its tremors, a silent observer on the precipice of a storm. The Duchess of Rutland's ball loomed, a glittering facade behind which the true drama of Blackwood was about to unfold, a drama that would irrevocably alter her quiet, predetermined path, pushing her into a destiny she could never have imagined. The air grew heavy, charged with an electric anticipation, as if the very stones of Blackwood Manor held their breath, waiting for the inevitable. Eleanor clutched the doll tighter, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the darkening horizon, a silent prayer forming on her lips for strength and clarity in the face of the unknown. The storm was coming, both outside and within the walls of Blackwood, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that nothing would ever be the same. The quiet life she had painstakingly built, a life of routine and predictable hardship, was about to be irrevocably shattered, and she could only brace herself for the impact. The Duchess of Rutland's ballroom was a dazzling spectacle, a kaleidoscope of silk, lace and jewels, shimmering under the glow of 1,000 candles. The air thrummed with the murmur of polite conversation, punctuated by the lilting strains of a string orchestra. Eleanor, relegated to a discreet corner of the gallery with Lady Beatrice and Master Thomas, felt a familiar pang of longing mixed with a detached fascination. From her vantage point, she could observe the glittering assembly, a world she was close enough to touch, yet forever separated from by an invisible, unyielding barrier. Lady Beatrice, resplendent in a pale blue gown, chattered excitedly, pointing out various ladies and gentlemen, while Master Thomas, looking rather overwhelmed, clung to Eleanor's hand. Eleanor herself wore her best, a simple dark green gown, meticulously mended and pressed, which, though modest, did little to diminish her natural grace. Her auburn hair was neatly pinned, a few rebellious tendrils framing her delicate features. She felt like a moth drawn to a flame, knowing she could never truly be part of its warmth. The Duke of Blackwood, Alistair, was, as always, the cynosure of all eyes. He moved through the throng with an effortless elegance, his dark evening attire a stark contrast to the vibrant colours around him. He was engaged in conversation with a striking blonde woman, Lady Seraphina, whose laughter, bright and tinkling, carried across the room. Eleanor watched him, a strange mix of resentment and reluctant admiration stirring within her. He was undeniably handsome, a figure of aristocratic perfection, yet his arrogance, she knew, was as boundless as his wealth. He caught her eye once, across the vast expanse of the ballroom, and for a fleeting moment his gaze seemed to hold an unreadable intensity, a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher, before he turned back to Lady Seraphina, his expression once more composed and aloof. Eleanor quickly averted her eyes, feeling a blush creep up her neck, annoyed at her own susceptibility to his fleeting attention. The evening wore on, a blur of music and polite smiles. Eleanor was about to lead the children back to their carriage when a footman approached her, his face a mask of polite urgency. "Miss Vance, His Grace requests your presence. Immediately." Eleanor's heart gave a sudden lurch. The Duke never requested her presence at social events. A cold dread began to coil in her stomach. She instructed the children to wait with the footman and followed him, her steps growing heavier with each passing moment. He led her not to a quiet antechamber, but directly into the heart of the ballroom, where a hush had fallen over the crowd. All eyes were now fixed on the Duke, who stood in the center of the room, a grim expression on his face, a thick, leather-bound journal clutched in his hand. Lady Seraphina stood beside him, her face a picture of bewildered concern. Eleanor felt a sudden chill, a premonition of disaster. She stopped a few paces from him, her gaze fixed on the journal, a sickening sense of recognition washing over her. It was the same journal she had seen him with in the library, the one that had caused such a shift in his demeanour. "Your Grace," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sudden silence. Alistair turned to her, his grey eyes blazing with an emotion she couldn't quite name: anger, humiliation, a desperate kind of fury. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice ringing through the suddenly silent ballroom, each word a hammer blow to her fragile composure. "It seems I have made a most unfortunate discovery." He held up the journal, its aged pages visible to the curious onlookers. "This, ladies and gentlemen, is my late grandfather's true last will and testament. A document, it appears, that was deliberately concealed for decades." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. "And within its pages," he continued, his voice laced with a bitter irony, "is a clause that dictates my future, and indeed the future of Blackwood." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled faces, lingering on Eleanor's, a cruel glint in his eyes. "It states, quite unequivocally, that upon my 25th year I am to take, as my wife, Miss Eleanor Vance, the Governess." All the words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, then exploded into a cacophony of whispers, gasps, and shocked exclamations. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, her knees threatening to buckle beneath her. The room began to spin, the glittering lights blurring into a dizzying haze. She heard snippets of conversation, sharp and cruel, like shards of glass. "A governess? Impossible. The Duke of Blackwood to marry a mere nobody? What an outrage!" Lady Seraphina, her face now pale with shock, stared at Eleanor with a mixture of pity and disdain. Alistair's voice cut through the din, cold and precise. "I assure you, this is as much a shock to me as it is to you all. This arrangement is a travesty, a cruel jest from beyond the grave. I have no intention of honouring such a ridiculous, antiquated decree." His gaze, filled with contempt, landed squarely on Eleanor. "Miss Vance, I regret to inform you that your services are no longer required at Blackwood Manor. Effective immediately." Eleanor felt as if she had been struck. The world, which had been spinning moments before, now seemed to freeze. The humiliation was a physical blow, a searing pain that ripped through her very soul. Her carefully constructed composure shattered, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the faces of the curious, judgmental onlookers. She could feel their stares, their whispers, their barely concealed glee at her downfall. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was not just dismissal. It was public execution, a brutal severing of her last thread of security, delivered with a callous disregard for her feelings or her future. She had been publicly shamed, stripped of her dignity, and cast out into the unforgiving world, all for a promise made by a dead man. "Your Grace," she managed to stammer, her voice trembling, I do not understand. I had no knowledge of this will. I assure you I would never presume." "Presume, Miss Vance," Alistair cut her off, his voice dripping with scorn. "Your very presence here, your very existence, is now a presumption. Do you truly believe I would allow myself to be bound by such a ludicrous document? To marry a woman of your station? It is an insult to my family, to my title, to everything I stand for." He gestured dismissively towards her, as if she were an unpleasant stain on the pristine ballroom floor. "You are dismissed. A carriage will be arranged to take you from Blackwood at dawn. Do not attempt to contact me or any member of my household again." The finality of his words, the utter contempt in his tone, crushed any remaining hope. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Her world was crumbling, not slowly, but in a sudden, violent collapse. The grand ballroom, once a distant, glittering dream, had become a stage for her utter ruin. She could not breathe, could not think. All she could feel was the burning shame, the searing injustice, and the desperate, overwhelming need to escape. To escape the pitying glances, the sneering smiles, the suffocating weight of public scorn. She turned, blindly pushing her way through the murmuring crowd, her vision blurred by tears, her ears ringing with the echoes of his cruel words. She had nowhere to go, no family, no friends, no prospects. The golden cage had not merely opened, it had violently ejected her, leaving her adrift in a world that had suddenly become cold and hostile. She stumbled out of the ballroom, past the bewildered children, past the shocked footmen, and into the cold, unforgiving night, her heart a shattered mess, her future a terrifying blank canvas of despair. The wind howled, mirroring the tempest raging within her soul as she fled Blackwood Manor, leaving behind not just a position but every shred of her dignity and hope. The carriage ride back to the manor was a blur of tears and choked sobs. The reality of her situation slowly, painfully, sinking in. She was utterly alone, cast out, and utterly ruined. The carriage, a plain, hired conveyance, rattled along the muddy country lanes, carrying Eleanor away from Blackwood Manor and into an uncertain future. The dawn light, grey and unforgiving, did little to dispel the gloom that clung to her. She had spent the night in a haze of shock and despair, packing her meagre belongings with trembling hands. The image of Alistair's contemptuous face burned into her memory. Now, as the manor receded into the distance, a cold, hollow ache settled in her chest. She had nowhere to go, no family to turn to, no funds beyond a small severance given by the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, who had offered a few words of genuine sympathy. The world, which had always been a challenging place, now seemed utterly hostile. Her only distant relative, a great-aunt she had barely known, lived in a small cottage on the outskirts of Bath. It was a desperate hope, a fragile thread to cling to, but it was all she had. The journey was long and arduous, a blur of inns and uncomfortable nights, each mile deepening her sense of isolation. When she finally arrived in Bath, the elegant Georgian architecture and bustling streets seemed to mock her dishevelled appearance and broken spirit. She found her great-aunt's cottage, a charming but modest dwelling nestled amongst a row of similar homes, its small garden a riot of colourful blooms. Her great-aunt, Lady Augusta Thorne, was a revelation. Far from the stern, elderly relative Eleanor had vaguely remembered, Lady Augusta was a woman of vibrant spirit and sharp intellect, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes sparkling with an intelligent curiosity. She was a widow of independent means, a patron of the arts, and a woman who had, in her youth, defied many societal conventions. She listened to Eleanor's tearful, halting account of the events at Blackwood with a quiet intensity, her hand gently patting Eleanor's arm. "Alistair, Duke of Blackwood, you say?" Lady Augusta mused, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Ah, yes, the grandson of old Duke Alistair. A formidable man he was, and a mischievous one too in his own way. It sounds precisely like something he would concoct to shake up the staid sensibilities of his descendants." Eleanor, still raw with humiliation, could only shake her head. "It was a cruel jest, Aunt. He cast me out, publicly shamed me. I am ruined." Lady Augusta's smile softened. "Ruined? Nonsense, child. You are merely redirected. Sometimes the greatest misfortunes are simply blessings in disguise, forcing us onto paths we would never have dared to tread otherwise. And as for the Duke's opinion, what does it matter? A man who judges another based on their station rather than their character is hardly worth a moment's thought." Her words, delivered with a calm certainty, were a balm to Eleanor's wounded spirit. Lady Augusta offered her not just refuge, but understanding, a rare commodity in Eleanor's life. She encouraged Eleanor to rest, to eat, and slowly, painstakingly, to begin to heal. Under Lady Augusta's gentle guidance, Eleanor began to emerge from the depths of her despair. The cottage, filled with books and vibrant paintings, became a sanctuary. Lady Augusta introduced her to a new social circle, one far removed from the rigid hierarchies of the aristocracy. These were individuals who valued wit, intelligence, and genuine conversation above titles or fortunes. There were scholars, artists, writers, and independent-minded women who engaged in lively debates and discussions, their minds as sharp as their tongues. Eleanor, initially shy and withdrawn, found herself slowly drawn into their stimulating conversations. Her own sharp intellect, long suppressed by the demands of her governess duties, began to blossom. She discovered a joy in intellectual discourse, in expressing her own opinions without fear of censure, a freedom she had never known. It was at one of Lady Augusta's weekly literary salons that Eleanor met Mr. Julian Thorne. He was a distant cousin of Lady Augusta's, a man of quiet charm and thoughtful demeanour, with kind, intelligent eyes and a gentle smile. Julian was a scholar himself, a man of letters who preferred the quiet contemplation of books to the boisterous pursuits of society. He was an outsider in his own way, not by birth but by choice, eschewing the superficiality of the ton for deeper, more meaningful connections. From their first conversation, Eleanor felt an immediate connection. He listened to her with genuine interest, his gaze warm and respectful, seeing not a disgraced governess, but a woman of intelligence and spirit. He spoke of literature, philosophy, and the changing world with an eloquence that captivated her. "Miss Vance," he said one evening, as they discussed a newly published volume of poetry, "your insights are truly remarkable. It is rare to find such depth of understanding, particularly in one so young." Eleanor blushed, unaccustomed to such sincere praise. "You are too kind, Mr. Thorne. My education was unconventional." Julian smiled. "Unconventional, perhaps, but clearly thorough, and far more valuable, I suspect, than the rote memorization often inflicted upon young ladies of fashion. A mind that thinks for itself is a rare and precious thing." His words resonated deeply within her, affirming a part of herself she had long believed to be a burden. He saw her worth, not in her lineage or her wealth, but in her mind, in her character. He treated her as an equal, a partner in conversation, a concept that was revolutionary to her. As the weeks turned into months, Eleanor found herself spending more and more time in Julian's company. They would walk through the picturesque streets of Bath, discussing everything from ancient history to the latest political pamphlets. He introduced her to new authors, new ideas, expanding her world in ways she had never imagined. With Julian, she felt truly seen, truly appreciated. He never mentioned Blackwood, never alluded to her past, simply accepted her for who she was, a woman with a keen mind and a gentle heart. His presence was a quiet strength, a steady anchor in the turbulent waters of her recent past. He was everything the Duke was not: kind, humble, genuinely interested in her thoughts and feelings. One crisp autumn afternoon, as they sat in a quiet corner of a tea garden, Julian looked at her, his eyes filled with a warmth that made her heart flutter. "Eleanor," he began, using her given name for the first time, a small intimacy that sent a thrill through her. "I have come to value our conversations, and indeed your company, more than I can express. You possess a spirit that shines brightly, even after what you have endured." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I believe you are destined for more than a life of quiet obscurity. You have a voice, a perspective that deserves to be heard." His words ignited a spark within her, a flicker of hope she had thought long extinguished. She had been so consumed by her humiliation, by the injustice of her dismissal, that she had forgotten her own capabilities, her own potential. Julian saw it, and in his eyes, she began to see it too. The world, which had seemed so bleak and unforgiving, now held a glimmer of possibility. She was not ruined. She was merely at a crossroads, and for the first time in a long time she felt a surge of courage, a quiet determination to forge a new path, one that was truly her own. The whispers of change were growing louder, promising a future she could actively choose, rather than one dictated by circumstance or the cruel whims of a duke. The transformation was gradual, yet profound. Under Lady Augusta's tutelage and Julian Thorne's unwavering support, Eleanor Vance shed the skin of the timid, disgraced governess. She no longer wore the drab, practical gowns that had been her uniform at Blackwood. Lady Augusta, with her impeccable taste and generous spirit, had insisted on a new wardrobe, simple yet elegant, in colours that complemented Eleanor's auburn hair and brought out the sparkle in her blue eyes. Her hair, once severely pinned, was now styled in soft curls that framed her face, lending her an air of sophisticated charm. More importantly, her confidence had blossomed. She spoke with a newfound assurance, her opinions articulated with clarity and wit, honed by countless discussions in Lady Augusta's salon. She was still Eleanor, gentle and kind, but now she was also Eleanor, intelligent and self-possessed, a woman who knew her own worth. It was Lady Augusta who orchestrated her re-entry into society, not the glittering, superficial society of the London ton, but a more discerning circle in Bath, where intellect and character held sway over lineage. Eleanor attended concerts, lectures, and intimate dinner parties, always with Lady Augusta and often with Julian by her side. She found herself engaging in conversations with prominent figures, her insights on literature and current affairs earning her quiet respect and admiration. The whispers of her past, of her ignominious dismissal from Blackwood, had reached Bath, but here they were met not with scorn, but with a sympathetic curiosity and often a quiet indignation at the Duke's behaviour. One crisp spring evening, at a charity ball hosted by a prominent local family, Eleanor found herself face to face with the very man who had sought to ruin her. The Duke of Blackwood, Alistair, had arrived in Bath, ostensibly for a brief visit to a distant relative, but Eleanor suspected his presence was more to do with the persistent rumours surrounding his grandfather's will and the scandal it had caused. He stood across the ballroom, a dark, brooding figure amidst the lighter hues of the assembly, his gaze sweeping the room with his usual air of detached superiority. When his eyes landed on Eleanor, a flicker of surprise, quickly followed by something akin to disbelief, crossed his features. He had clearly not expected to see her, let alone to see her transformed. Eleanor felt a familiar tremor of apprehension, but this time it was quickly replaced by a surge of defiant strength. She met his gaze directly, her chin held high, a faint, unreadable smile playing on her lips. She was no longer the cowering governess he had dismissed. Julian, sensing the tension, gently placed a hand on her arm. his presence a silent, reassuring anchor. Alistair, recovering from his initial shock, began to make his way towards her, his expression hardening with each step. He was accompanied by Lady Seraphina, who looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice clipped, a hint of challenge in his tone. "I confess, I am surprised to see you here, and in such company." His gaze flickered to Julian, a clear disdain in his eyes. Eleanor's smile did not falter. "Your Grace," she replied, her voice calm and steady, "I find Bath to be a most agreeable city, and Lady Augusta a most generous hostess. As for my company, I am fortunate to be surrounded by individuals who value intellect and kindness above all else." Her words were a subtle yet pointed rebuke. Alistair's jaw tightened. "Indeed, it seems you have found your feet, despite circumstances." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "I trust you have not forgotten your origins." "On the contrary, Your Grace," Eleanor countered, her voice gaining strength. "I remember them quite clearly. They taught me the value of hard work, resilience, and the importance of forging one's own path, rather than relying on inherited titles or unearned privilege." The words hung in the air, a direct challenge to his very being. Lady Seraphina shifted uncomfortably beside him, clearly wishing to be elsewhere. Julian stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "I believe Miss Vance has made her position quite clear, Your Grace. Her past is her own, and her present is one of considerable respect and admiration within this community." Alistair's gaze sharpened, a flash of rivalry in his eyes. "And you, Mr. Thorne? I presume you are the architect of this transformation." His tone was laced with thinly veiled contempt. "I am merely a friend, Your Grace," Julian replied, his composure unruffled, "who recognizes true worth when he sees it. A quality, I fear, that is often overlooked in certain circles." The Duke's face flushed with anger, but before he could retort, Lady Augusta, who had been observing the exchange with a keen eye, swept forward. "Alistair, my dear boy," she said, her voice sweet but with an underlying steel, "how delightful to see you. I trust you are enjoying our humble Bath society. Perhaps you might learn a thing or two about genuine hospitality rather than the cold formality you are accustomed to." She then turned to Eleanor, her smile warm. "Eleanor, my dear, Mr. Davies is eager to discuss your thoughts on his latest essay. Do come." Eleanor curtsied gracefully to the Duke, a gesture of polite dismissal rather than deference, and allowed Lady Augusta to lead her away, Julian following closely behind. As she walked, she felt a profound sense of liberation. She had faced him, the man who had tried to crush her, and she had emerged not only unscathed, but victorious. The public humiliation had been transformed into a public triumph, a testament to her resilience. Later that evening, as the ball wound down, Julian sought her out in a quiet alcove. "Eleanor," he said, his voice soft, "you handled yourself with remarkable dignity tonight. I was immensely proud of you." Eleanor smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you, Julian. Your presence and Lady Augusta's gave me strength. I truly believe I would not have survived without your kindness." He took her hand, his touch gentle and warm. "You are a woman of extraordinary courage, Eleanor, and I find myself quite captivated by that courage and by everything else that makes you who you are." He paused, his gaze earnest. "I know your past has been difficult, and I know the world can be cruel, but I believe in a future where you are free to be entirely yourself, to pursue your passions, to live a life of purpose and joy. I want to be a part of that future, Eleanor. I want to offer you a life, not of obligation or compromise, but of true partnership, of shared dreams and mutual respect." He squeezed her hand gently. "Eleanor Vance, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The question hung in the air, a beacon of hope in the aftermath of her confrontation with the Duke. It was not a proposal born of duty or a forgotten will, but of genuine affection and profound respect. It was an offer of a completely new future, one she could choose, one where she was valued, loved, and free. Her heart swelled with a joy so profound it brought tears to her eyes. This was not just a proposal. It was a promise of a life she had only dared to dream of, a life where her worth was not measured by her station, but by her spirit. The news of Mr. Julian Thorne's proposal to Miss Eleanor Vance spread through Bath society like wildfire, quickly reaching the ears of the Duke of Blackwood. The reaction was varied, a fascinating tapestry of gossip, speculation, and genuine delight. In Lady Augusta's circle, the engagement was celebrated as a triumph of character over convention, a testament to Eleanor's resilience and Julian's discerning heart. Friends and acquaintances offered their heartfelt congratulations, praising Eleanor's intelligence and grace and Julian's steadfast devotion. However, in the more traditional echelons of society, particularly among those who still clung to the rigid dictates of birth and fortune, the news was met with a mixture of scandalized whispers and thinly veiled disapproval. A governess marrying into a respectable, albeit not titled family, it was simply not done. The Duke of Blackwood, Alistair, was reportedly furious. His pride, already wounded by Eleanor's defiant composure at the ball, was now dealt a crushing blow. The idea that the woman he had publicly dismissed, the woman he was supposedly bound to marry by an absurd will, would choose another, and a mere scholar at that, was an affront he could not tolerate. He saw it as a personal challenge, a deliberate act of defiance against his authority. Rumours circulated that he had extended his stay in Bath, his presence a dark cloud over the city's usually cheerful atmosphere, his temper growing increasingly volatile. Eleanor, however, found herself remarkably unconcerned by the Duke's displeasure or society's disapproval. She was enveloped in the warmth of Julian's affection and Lady Augusta's unwavering support. Her days were now filled with preparations for her new life, a life she was actively choosing rather than one imposed upon her. She and Julian spent hours discussing their future, their shared dreams of a life dedicated to learning, to quiet pursuits, and to each other. They planned a modest wedding, a small, intimate affair at Lady Augusta's home, surrounded by those who truly cared for them. Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet joy that settled deep within her soul. One blustery afternoon, a week before the wedding, a note arrived at Lady Augusta's cottage, bearing the unmistakable crest of the Duke of Blackwood. It was a summons, curt and demanding, requesting Eleanor's presence at his temporary residence in Bath. Lady Augusta, her lips pressed into a thin line, advised Eleanor to ignore it. "He has no claim over you, my dear. You owe him nothing." Eleanor arrived at the Duke's rented townhouse, her heart beating a steady rhythm of resolve. She was no longer afraid of him. She was no longer the girl he had humiliated. She was Julian Thorne's fiancée, a woman of her own making. She was shown into a drawing room where Alistair stood by the window, his back to her, his posture rigid. He turned as she entered, his grey eyes sweeping over her, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. He was still the formidable Duke, impeccably dressed, but there was a subtle tension in his shoulders, a hint of vulnerability she had never seen before. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice devoid of its usual arrogance, almost subdued, "I trust you received my summons." "I did, Your Grace," Eleanor replied, her voice calm and clear, "and I am here." "What is it you wish to say?" He gestured to a chair, but Eleanor remained standing. I wish to speak with you about this engagement, this absurd will, my grandfather's decree." He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of frustration. "I confess, I do not understand it. Why would he bind me to a governess? And why would you, knowing the circumstances, choose to marry another, thereby forfeiting the Blackwood fortune?" Eleanor met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "Your Grace, I had no knowledge of your grandfather's will until you chose to reveal it in such a public manner. And as for marrying Mr. Thorne, I do so because I love him, and because he respects me, not for my station, but for who I am." The Blackwood fortune and the title of Duchess hold no appeal for me if they come at the cost of my dignity and my happiness. I choose a life of genuine affection and intellectual companionship over one of gilded servitude." Alistair stared at her, a strange mix of anger and something akin to grudging respect in his eyes. "You truly mean that? You would give up all that Blackwood offers for a scholar?" "I would give up all that Blackwood offers for my freedom, Your Grace," Eleanor stated, her voice firm. "For the freedom to choose my own path, to love whom I choose, and to live a life of purpose, not merely one of obligation. Your grandfather's will, while perhaps intended to be a jest, ultimately served to free me. It forced me out of a life where I was invisible and into one where I am seen, valued, and loved." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her, as if seeing her for the first time. I misjudged you, Miss Vance," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I acted poorly. My pride, my anger at my grandfather's manipulation blinded me. I offer you my apologies for the manner of your dismissal." It was not a full apology, not an admission of true remorse, but for Alistair, Duke of Blackwood, it was a monumental concession. Eleanor felt a pang of something akin to pity for him. He was a man trapped by his own arrogance, by the rigid expectations of his world. "Your apology is accepted, Your Grace," he said softly. "I wish you well." With that she curtsied, a final graceful gesture of closure, and turned to leave. As she reached the door, Alistair's voice stopped her. "Miss Vance," he called out, "what will become of the will? If you do not marry me, the estate passes to my cousin." Eleanor turned, a faint smile on her lips. "That, Your Grace, is no longer my concern. It is your burden to bear, not mine. My path is chosen." And with that, she walked out, leaving the Duke of Blackwood alone in his grand drawing-room, grappling with the consequences of a lost will and a promise he had scorned. She stepped out into the crisp Bath air, feeling lighter than she had in years, her heart soaring with the promise of her chosen future. The old life, the golden cage, was firmly behind her. She was free. Months later, the scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the aroma of blooming roses in the small, sun-drenched cottage that Eleanor now called home. She hummed a cheerful tune as she arranged a vase of wildflowers on the polished oak table, her movements graceful and unhurried. The cottage, nestled in a quiet village just outside Bath, was a haven of peace and intellectual stimulation, a stark contrast to the oppressive grandeur of Blackwood Manor. She was no longer Miss Vance, the governess, but Mrs. Thorne, the beloved wife of Julian, and a woman who had found her true calling. Her marriage to Julian was everything she had dreamed of and more. Their days were filled with shared laughter, stimulating conversations, and a deep, abiding affection. Julian, true to his nature, was a devoted and respectful husband who cherished her intellect as much as her heart. They spent their mornings reading and writing, collaborating on articles for literary journals, and often engaging in lively debates over philosophical texts. In the afternoons, they would walk through the picturesque countryside, discussing their ideas, their hands clasped, their spirits intertwined. Eleanor had discovered a passion for botany, spending hours in their small, vibrant garden, nurturing plants with the same care she now applied to her own flourishing life. She also volunteered at a local school for underprivileged children, teaching them to read and write, finding immense satisfaction in empowering young minds, a far cry from the restrictive duties at Blackwood. One particularly bright afternoon, as she and Julian sat in their garden sipping tea, Eleanor reflected on the tumultuous events that had led her to this serene happiness. "It is strange, is it not?" she mused, gazing at a particularly vibrant rose. "How the greatest humiliation of my life ultimately led to my greatest joy. If the Duke had not cast me out, if that will had never been discovered, I would still be trapped in that golden cage, believing that was all life had to offer." Julian reached across the table and took her hand, his eyes warm with affection. Indeed, my love, sometimes the universe has a peculiar way of guiding us to where we are meant to be. Your strength, your resilience, and your unwavering spirit were always there, Eleanor. You merely needed the opportunity to let them shine. Eleanor smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her entire face. And you, Julian, gave me that opportunity. You saw me, truly saw me, when no one else did. You taught me that my worth was not defined by my birth or my station, but by my character and my mind. They had heard snippets of news regarding the Duke of Blackwood. After Eleanor's refusal to be bound by the will, the Blackwood estate had indeed passed to his distant cousin, a rather unassuming gentleman who surprisingly proved to be a far more benevolent landlord than Alistair. The Duke, stripped of a significant portion of his fortune and, more importantly, his pride, had retreated from society, his arrogance now tempered by a bitter resentment. He had eventually married Lady Seraphina, a match of convenience rather than affection, and rumour had it that their union was a cold and unhappy one, a gilded cage of a different sort. He remained a powerful figure, but his reputation had been irrevocably tarnished by the scandal of the will and his cruel treatment of Eleanor. He was still the Duke, but he was a Duke diminished, haunted by the choices he had made and the happiness he had so carelessly discarded. Eleanor felt no malice towards him, only a quiet understanding. His fate, she realized, was a consequence of his own character, his inability to see beyond the superficial trappings of wealth and title. Her own happiness, however, was a testament to the power of choice, of embracing authenticity, and of finding love where it was least expected. She had bloomed where she was planted, not in the grand, opulent gardens of Blackwood, but in the humble, loving soil of her own chosen life. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across their garden, Eleanor leaned her head on Julian's shoulder, a profound sense of gratitude filling her heart. She had found not just love, but freedom, purpose, and a deep, abiding joy. The dusty old chest, the lost will, and the Duke's cruel promise had, against all odds, led her to a life more rich and fulfilling than any duchess could ever hope for. Her story was a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a reminder that true worth lies not in titles or fortunes, but in the courage to choose one's own path and the love that blossoms along the way. She was Eleanor Thorne, a woman who had defied expectations, embraced her true self, and found her own extraordinary destiny. Thank you for listening to The Duke Opened the Dusty Old Chest, revealing a lost will and a promise to wed the Governess. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to the channel for more stories and leave a comment below to share your thoughts. Your support helps us bring more Regency romances to life.